All right, so we're going to be talking about principled arguments, and just as an overview, everything that, or like most of the things that we've been like discussing up until now are what are called practical arguments. In other words, it's about, oh, uh, students won't like it, parents will be harmed, the economy will be damaged. All of those things, those are practical arguments because they're about real impacts that occur to people. Principled arguments, on the other hand, are separate from that. They say that, oh, okay, maybe uh maybe the poor are benefited, but it's still wrong to do just because it's innately incorrect. That there's some like underlying moral or ethical reason that means that regardless of practical benefits, it's principally and morally wrong. So that's what we're trying to discuss here. Okay, so let's get into it. First, I'll just describe a bit more about what principles are, and then go into examples. And like the examples are kind of like the most important part. So they're not just like small examples, they are the core of what the lecture is about. But okay, firstly about principles. So I've explained what they are, but if we have an example motion here, this house would execute students who break school rules. Can someone tell me a principal reason or a practical reason, just anything about this? Uh, yeah, Byron?
The principled argument could be it is innately wrong to kill people for just breaking the school rules.
Yeah, exactly. So the underlying kind of assumption there is that breaking school rules isn't that bad of a like crime, or you haven't done anything like so seriously wrong. And so executing students might not be the best solution there. Ayush?
Just to play devil's advocate, we could we could take a principle from the other side and say that I believe that school rules are very strong rules and they have to be very harsh, and students should be aware and make sure that none of these rules are broken to create a better environment. So that's a principle I have. That's a principle I hold. Hypothetically,
Sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like, that makes sense as well. So, or makes sense maybe isn't the right word, but sure, like that is also a principle. Uh, so if we like really look into it here, there are a couple of practical reasons of why we should and shouldn't. Practically, if you implement this, then students are probably going to listen to these school rules. They're going to do all of their homework. They're going to be less disruptive in class, right? Like they don't want to die. And the problem is there's also practical reasons not to, which is that parents would pull their children out of school because they're like, wait, if my child messes up, they'll get killed. So, probably best not to send them to school at all. But like all of this isn't actually what the debate is about. Like you can say these practical reasons, but like that's not what the debate's about. What we care about is the principle, which is that punishments should be proportional to the severity of the crime. In other words, if you do shoplifting, then maybe you get fined, while if you like uh you know, murder someone, then you'll be in jail for decades. So that's how punishments should work. That the worse the crime is, the worse the punishment is. On the other hand, this motion breaks that proportionality because the crime isn't that bad. You've just broken school rules. Like objectively, it's not that bad. Um, and executing them clearly is not proportional. So that's kind of the problem here. That's the principle. So now let's go into specific principles. And this is like what's actually important. In your debates, you should be thinking about, can I apply this principle? And then consider all of the different like facets that go into making it a legitimate principle. So the first one is autonomy. And some of you might have like heard this in one of the debates yesterday. I think someone mentioned it because it's about choice, right? And yesterday we were talking about how, at least in the older debate, how university students don't um, have the choice to like pursue the career path they want, or that in the younger debate, students don't have the choice to wear what they want. So both of those things are about choice or autonomy. And the principle here is that people should be able to decide things about themselves. They should be able to decide their future. And generally speaking, we want to make sure that people have more choice rather than less choice. And there's actually two things that go into making this a legitimate principle. There's a practical component and a principled component. Practically, the reason why this principle makes sense is because most of the time you're making better choices about yourself if you had lots of choices, as opposed to if you were forced to do a certain thing. So if you force everyone to study mathematics at university, then that's probably not a good idea because people have different skills and they know their own skills better than you do, which means they can make a more informed choice about themselves and they're likely going to succeed more if they followed their own choices. So that's the practical. Principally, what we're trying to say is that even if it's not the best choice, so even if the practical doesn't pan out, people should still be allowed to make their own choices purely because we respect people's choices. That okay, maybe society will be harmed, maybe they'll be harmed, but we should still respect their choice because it's their choice. So that's one part of it. But to continue, there are a few ways in which autonomy doesn't hold up. So you can't always just say, oh, if you have more choice, then it's better. Because that would make debates very one-sided. And that's not actually how things work. Things are more complicated than that. So for a choice to be useful and valuable, there are two factors that go into it. Firstly, it must be an informed choice. In other words, if you don't realize all of the choices that are available to you, or if you just don't understand what the choices entail, you don't understand the consequences of you making that choice, then it's not a valuable choice. You can't be effectively making that choice in a way that will benefit you. A good example of this would be to say that a lot of the time, children don't have the same rights as adults in terms of choosing things for themselves or voting for the country. And most of that is because they're not always as informed. People believe that children aren't as informed until a certain age, and so their choices can't be as valued. Which makes sense because can you really vote on politics when you're 10 years old? Probably not. You just don't really understand what these different politicians are aiming to do. And so only after a certain age do you become informed enough to make a valuable choice about politics. The second thing is about coercion. So coercion means that you're being forced to make a choice. In other words, you still have a choice in the sense that if a robber is trying to mug you, you have the choice to either give them your wallet or not. But at the same time, it's a very coerced choice. There are serious consequences if you don't listen to what they say, which means that most of the time you're just going to do what they say, right? But that wasn't a free choice. You couldn't do anything about it. So those are the two bits there. Yeah, so we can go into these examples. The first one is about making college free. What this would do is just give more option to people. If they value higher education, they can choose to go to college. If they don't have to. So if you are making if you're making more choices available to the public, then they're likely going to benefit from that. On the other hand, there's this example of becoming a violent felon because a robber is letting people choose whether they give their money to you or they die. But as I said, that's a coerced choice, and so it is not. It's not the same. You can't think of it in the same way. Okay, moving on to rights. Before that, are there any questions about autonomy? Malolan?
So to confirm, coerce is just the opposite of autonomy.
In a sense, yeah. but it's more nuanced in the sense that like even when it's coerced, you do have choices, which is what autonomy is all about. It's just that like the choices um aren't freely chosen. The opposite of autonomy would probably be like a mandate that like you must like wear school uniforms. That is taking choice away from you, right? Coercion is more along the lines of you have the choice to wear a school uniform or not, but if you don't wear a school uniform, you'll be heavily bullied, right? So technically you have a choice, but you're heavily influenced to make a certain choice. Does that make
So
sense?
you should be able to accept the consequences.
Uh, you should be able to make choices without there being unreasonable consequences.
Okay.
Ayush?
So, by this logic, theoretically, we should allow people to take up any profession they want. Because of autonomy, they can have more choices on what profession they want to do, which is informed and not coerced. So, by this logic, we should allow people to take up the profession of criminal.
So that's exactly what this example is about, right? Most of the time, yeah, more choice is better, but in specific scenarios where you're like obviously if you're harming other people, then there are other principles that come into play, which is like your right to uh like your personal space and your property. So if when you start violating other principles, then you'll have to compare them together. Malola?
Yeah, what does the opposition do if it goes to one-sided because of this principle?
So
Principled art.
I'll go into that, but the main things you can do is either focus on the practical and say, okay, maybe the principle goes to the other side, but there's so many practical reasons, like so many practical benefits that we're willing to sacrifice the principle. Or you can try attacking the principle, which I'll get into. Okay, before that, another example, which is about rights. So you've probably heard of your like the freedom of speech, the freedom to choose your religion, the right to vote. All of these are basic rights. But at the same time, rights are not absolute either. And so you do have to explain why does the right exist. The right to vote, for example, exists because of uh, like Western countries valuing democracy. And so, in order for the government to not be like allowed to take over and become autocratic, the right to vote is put in place to make sure democracy always stays in place. So that's kind of the underlying reason. It's to make sure the government doesn't have too much power. But rights can be violated, and it all depends on the situation. For example, the right to your freedom of speech, that is restricted in many ways. You're not allowed to insult other people. Like you're not allowed to do hate speech. You're not allowed to be racist. All of these things could fall into like the freedom of speech category, but there are exceptions. You aren't allowed to do those things. Um, does that make sense? Yeah, Ayush?
So, an example of showing why a light right might not always apply by justifying it is this house would raise the voting age to 21 because the whole point of the right to vote is to stop government from becoming tyrannical. But if 18 to 20-year-olds can't vote, it's not like the government would become tyrannical against specifically 18 to 20-year-olds. So that is one example of attacking a rights principle by seeing how why the right is justified. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's definitely one way you could go about it. And then the other thing you could add in is maybe the thing about informed choices as well, that uh, maybe if you're misinformed at younger ages, that's another reason why you shouldn't be allowed to vote. But yeah, things along those lines. Okay, next is reparations. Uh, And here, first of all, what are reparations? Reparations are paying back money to someone who has been wronged in the past. So you've hurt them before, and so you're compensating them by paying them money. Examples here could be that colonial powers should pay their colonies reparations. So countries like the UK, France, Portugal, they colonized lots of countries and harmed them in various ways. And so they should pay them reparations so that they can like rebuild their country more. Or another example could be giving women two votes. And the underlying reason here would be in the past, women have been wronged. They didn't have the right to vote until much later. And so, as reparations, they should be given extra like voting power. Okay, so that's the end of those examples. Questions, Malolon?
Well, principle wait, one sec. Principle of rights is basically autonomy, right? Because you're just giving them more choices.
No, I wouldn't say that. So if you look into it, it's not about giving them choices per se. Choices is a more like direct kind of thing of choosing between various things. The right to vote is just like a yes or no, right? You either you vote or you don't. Um, that's not really about choosing. It's just more about what you're allowed to do.
Okay.
Okay. So now those are the principled arguments. That's probably the most important bit. Here, I'll just quickly go over how you might respond to principled arguments. But realistically, this is getting into like quite complicated territory, and I don't think it's going to come up that much. But there are like three ways you can do it. Either you explain why the principle is unjustified, that, oh, in this specific scenario, the like basic justifications that usually hold up the principle no longer apply. So that might be things like hate speech, right? Secondly is a thought experiment. I'll go more into that. And thirdly is weighing principles against each other. So if your side also has a principled argument, but a different one, then you can compare the two arguments and say which principle makes more sense. I'll go into like analyzing the justification with just an example. The example is this house would, as an African American male, fight during the Vietnam War. So just some basic context, the US was fighting Vietnam. This was, let's say, about 60 years ago, maybe. Um, and so the principle for why the African American male should fight is possibly a responsibility to their country. And this would just be like the general reason why anyone fights in a war, right? Why do you go into service and fight for your country? It's because the country does quite a lot for you. They protect you during times of peace. They provide things like public schools, roads, possibly national health care, depending on your country. So there are things which your country does for you for decades, for most of your life. And so if there's a situation where the country now has to go fight in a war, a lot of the time you do have an obligation to fight for your country. On the other hand, how you could argue against this and attack the justification is say, okay, look at the actual context here. This isn't just a general motion. This is 60 years ago, and you are an African American male. And so you don't actually have an obligation to the United States of America because they haven't been treating you very well. You have like half the rights of other people. And so you aren't being treated like a citizen. You aren't being treated in the same way as others, and so you don't have an obligation to fight. So if the country isn't serving you well, then there's no obligation for you to serve your country, right? That would be trying to attack the justification which usually works about why someone would go to war for their country. Does that make sense? Again, secondly is a thought experiment. So Thought experiments work well when it's hard to like directly attack a principle, but in the back of your mind, it just feels like the principle doesn't work, right? Like this is a bit airy-fairy, but this is where you like solidify your thoughts using a thought experiment. This is also best described with an example. So let's say the motion was um, well, first of all, I'll go into like where uh it doesn't work, right? If the motion was about a doctor um taking its patients, like let's say a patient comes in and he tells the patient, "Don't worry, I'm just going to put you on some anesthetic while we do the surgery." But instead of like doing the surgery properly, what he does is he has three other patients in a nearby room who are about to die, and so he takes out the organs of this patient, puts them in the other patients, and saves three lives. So practically, you've used one life to save three. Like practically, that's just automatically a great benefit, right? But principally, it's very wrong because as a doctor, you have a right to help every patient that comes to you, and you've like actively made a promise to that patient where they trust you. They've put themselves in a position where they can't like do anything, right? They're on anesthetic, they're unconscious, and so they trust you to help them to the best of your ability. If you violate that trust and like save three other people for by like sacrificing them, then that's morally and ethically wrong. So hopefully that makes sense. Um, and so the thought experiment idea is often to take other motions that you might have and other principled arguments and try relating them to this example or like to a similar example. Because if you're able to show that what side proposition's argument is trying to do is equivalent to sacrificing one person for the sake of three in this like kind of like untrustworthy way, then you'll be able to convince the judge that okay, we should actually reconsider. It's not okay to like kill one person in this kind of way. Does that make sense? Okay. So last bit here now about weighing principles against each other. So this all kind of comes back to the things we've already talked about. It's about like the justification of a principle. And so you need to be explaining which principle has a stronger justification. One last example. Should you fight for your country or should you help your parents? Because if you go out to war and you're like put out and deployed in some other country, then you're not going to be able to help your parents. And maybe they're quite old, they need a lot of help to get by. So what should you do? There are two things here. Firstly, you might have an obligation to your country, as I described before. But on the other hand, you also have an obligation to your parents because they raised you for 20, 30 years, right? They've spent a lot of time and effort into raising you, and so you definitely have an obligation to now reciprocate and help them back. And so, which of these obligations is stronger? Your relationship with your parents is far more intimate. You've actually spent those like 18, 20, 30 years with them, and they've like deliberately spent their entire lives raising you. Your country, on the other hand, yes, maybe they help you every once in a while, but like realistically, they don't have a personal relationship with you. You don't actually have that much of an obligation to them. And so overall, between those two, most likely you can explain why the justification for helping your parents is stronger. Okay, that's all. Does that all make sense? Any questions about principled arguments? And these are quite difficult. Abir?
I didn't quite really understand autonomy, so can you explain once more?
Yeah, sure. Uh, okay, autonomy. So just quick overview. Autonomy is about choices. If you're able to choose about like things about yourself and your future, then that's something we value and that's something that we should allow people to have. The reasons why autonomy is good, firstly, is just because like in general, we do respect like things people want. Like if you say that you want to study like a specific subject at school, like maybe your parents will say something about it, but the government certainly won't like go out of their way to restrict your choice. The second bit is about like a practical component, which is just part of the principle, which says that if you make choices for yourself, you're probably going to make better choices. That if the government forced you to like study a specific subject, then like you're probably going to end up being forced to do a subject which doesn't fit you. And so if you chose for yourself, you'd be able to choose like something that makes more sense. Does that bit make sense, Nabir? Yeah. And then the second bit is just about when does autonomy not work? And it doesn't work when you're misinformed or when you're being coerced. So if you don't understand what these choices really mean, then it doesn't make sense to give you the like option to make those choices. And if you're being coerced into making a specific choice, then that's also another reason not to give you the choice in the first place. Yeah. So I can give an example here as well. Like, for example, there could be motions about marriage and like forced marriages, things along those lines, and giving women more more freedom in those regards. But if in a specific culture, and like if the motion's talking about a specific country or something, if quite often women are forced to marry specific people, if it's like arranged marriages, things along those lines, then it won't be a valuable choice anymore. So in that sense, it would be more justified for the government to come in and like try managing the situation rather than letting things be and say, oh, people should be able to make their own choices, because turns out they aren't actually making their own choices. They're like parents are forcing them to do things.